He counted money for a living, which meant he understood the true value of nothing. Robert Chen, 47 years old, had spent 23 years in the accounting department of the Sands Casino, a man so invisible that the cage operators would ask, "Is someone at that desk?" on Mondays when he took time off. His life was organized into categories: rent, utilities, insurance, food. Every expense justified, documented, accounted for. He possessed the kind of precision that made him invaluable and entirely forgettable. Then, over 18 months, he gave away $4,700,000, not in a moment of passion, not through coercion or manipulation, through the quiet mathematics of a man who had finally discovered that the only thing worth counting was the cost of being invisible. The money didn't vanish into embezzlement schemes or hidden accounts. It flowed directly to Eleanor Voss, a 28-year-old lounge singer who never asked for it, never demanded it, and, most critically, never knew the full extent of what was happening. He told her he had inheritance, old family money, investments that matured. She believed him because people believe what confirms their own narrative of how the world works. Wealthy men give gifts. That's simply what they do. What Eleanor didn't understand was that Robert was not wealthy. What Eleanor didn't know was that he was erasing himself. And what Robert didn't realize until it was far too late was that the only way to be truly invisible is to give until there is nothing left to give. The deception was real. The question is, who was deceiving whom? This is not a story about a calculating predator or a woman victimized by her own trust. This is the story of what happens when two people so desperate to be seen by someone else that neither can see the other clearly. This is the story of how love, expressed through the only language Robert understood, sacrifice, becomes a form of slow disappearance, and how accepting that sacrifice without asking why it's being offered makes you complicit in someone else's erasure. By the time anyone discovered what Robert had done, the mathematics were already complete. The equation was solved. And what remained was the understanding that sometimes the cruelest deceptions are the ones where the deceiver never intended to deceive at all. Robert Chen was born into visibility and trained into invisibility. His parents, immigrants from Canton, had 5 children. The oldest was a surgeon. The second was a lawyer. The third was a violinist who performed in San Francisco. The fourth was rebellious, worked in theater, lived in Los Angeles, embarrassed and delighted the family in equal measure. Robert was the 5th. His mother would tell people, "Robert is very responsible. Not brilliant, not ambitious, not talented, responsible." This word, repeated across his childhood, became his identity. A responsible son doesn't demand attention. A responsible son maintains systems. A responsible son makes money and doesn't ask questions about what money means. By 24, Robert had moved to Las Vegas with the Sands Casino, hired as a junior accountant. It was 1937. Las Vegas was still building itself into mythology. The city was a place where fortunes appeared and disappeared overnight, where identities were optional, where invisible systems controlled everything. Robert fit perfectly into this architecture. He became the man who knew where all the money went. He knew which accounts were being skimmed. He knew which dealers were stealing. He knew which executives were hiding assets from their wives. He was the keeper of every secret that required numbers. And no one knew him at all. His apartment was on East Charleston Boulevard, a 1-bedroom, adequate, nothing personal. His furniture was functional. His clothes were indistinguishable from other men's clothes. He had no hobbies, no friends, no romantic relationships. He worked. He ate. He slept. On weekends, he would drive alone to Red Rock Canyon and sit in his car watching rocks. He had read every novel in the downtown library twice. He had memorized the faces of the dealers at the Sands the way other men memorized poetry, not for meaning, but for the comfort of knowing something so thoroughly that it required no thought. By 47, Robert had become what he was always meant to be: a function, a system, a man who could be replaced by a slightly more efficient machine. He possessed approximately $4 million in savings, the result of decades of living below his means. This money sat in accounts. It earned interest. It meant nothing. He would die someday with bank statements and no one would attend his funeral because no one knew him well enough to be invited. Then, on a Tuesday in March of 1960, Eleanor walked into the Sands Casino. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. She had dark hair that she wore in waves, a thin face with prominent cheekbones, and a mouth that seemed to contain multiple expressions simultaneously: sadness and humor, resignation, and defiance. She was hired as a lounge singer, Tuesday through Saturday, 8 o'clock to midnight. Her voice was not technically perfect. It was better than perfect. It was honest. She sang songs about loss and longing, and she sang them like she understood exactly what longing cost. Robert attended the lounge on Tuesday nights. He would sit at the bar, nursing a single drink for 4 hours, watching her. He did not approach her. He did not speak to her. He simply existed in the same room as her, the way he had always existed, invisibly, observing, counting. Eleanor noticed him because Eleanor was trained to notice loneliness. She had grown up in Bakersfield with a father who drank and a mother who sang. She understood the shape of emptiness. She understood that some people take up space loudly, and some people disappear into silence. Robert was the latter. But Eleanor, unlike everyone else in Robert's life, recognized that disappearance as a form of presence. A man who sits alone in a casino bar for 4 hours, watching you, isn't disinterested. He's drowning. After 3 weeks, she walked over to his table during a break. She sat down without asking. She said, "You come every week. You never drink. Are you an auditor, or just very sad?" Robert, who had not had a genuine conversation with anyone in approximately 8 years, answered honestly. "Both," he said. "Mostly the second." That conversation lasted 40 minutes. Eleanor told him about growing up in Bakersfield, about her father, about moving to Las Vegas to escape and discovering that you cannot escape yourself, only the geography where people know your history. Robert told her, carefully as if revealing classified information, that he worked at the casino, that he had lived in Las Vegas for 23 years, that he had never left the state. When she returned to the stage, Robert felt something he had never experienced before. He felt seen. The psychological architecture of invisibility is this. Once you have spent decades training yourself not to expect recognition, the first moment of genuine attention feels like salvation. Eleanor had spoken to him like he was a person. She had not looked through him. She had looked at him. And Robert, who had built his entire emotional infrastructure on the expectation of invisibility, interpreted this simple act of human kindness as something far more profound. He interpreted it as love. Eleanor, for her part, saw a lonely man who needed kindness. She did not see what would develop. She had no way of knowing that her kindness would become the justification for his entire financial erasure. For Eleanor, Robert was an interesting person who came to see her sing. For Robert, Eleanor was the reason existence had become bearable. The difference between these two understandings would eventually destroy them both. In the 3 months following their first conversation, Robert established a new routine. He attended every performance Eleanor gave. Tuesday through Saturday, 8 o'clock to midnight, he would arrive at the lounge 15 minutes early and leave 15 minutes late. He would request specific songs. He would applaud at moments when other people applauded, except he meant it more than they did. Eleanor began to look for him in the audience. She began to sing certain songs directly at his table, a small nod to his presence. She would join him during breaks and tell him stories. Stories about her father, about singing, about why she had come to Las Vegas. Robert listened with the kind of attention that made people feel like their words were the most important words ever spoken. What Eleanor noticed was that Robert was lonely. What Eleanor did not notice was the specific quality of his loneliness, the kind that had calcified over decades, the kind that had stopped expecting anything and had therefore become desperate in ways that were invisible even to the person experiencing it. Robert, for the first time in his adult life, began to imagine a different existence, not a better existence necessarily, a different one where he was not entirely alone, one where he had someone to call on the telephone, one where his absence would be noticed. His accounting job had always been secure because he was meticulous. He had never taken a vacation. He had never asked for a raise. He had never done anything that would draw attention. But now, motivated by something he could not name, he began to make small modifications to his life. He bought a better car, a 1959 Cadillac, cream-colored, the kind of car that suggested taste and resources. He rented a nicer apartment, still modest but in a better neighborhood. He began wearing suits that cost more than $50. He was, in essence, constructing a persona, and the persona he was constructing was a man who was wealthy. Not ostentatiously wealthy, understated, the kind of wealth that comes from old money and quiet good taste. Eleanor accepted this version of Robert because it aligned with what she wanted to believe. She wanted to believe that the universe occasionally provided, that a good man could be lonely and also be fortunate, that the world sometimes balanced itself out. Robert's manufactured wealth was not suspicious to her because she was not looking for suspicion. She was looking for rescue. In these 3 months, Robert began to understand the mathematics of attraction. Eleanor liked being around him. Eleanor responded to his attention. Eleanor seemed to relax when he was present. Therefore, if he increased the variables, spent more time with her, gave her more reasons to depend on him, made himself more necessary to her existence, then the equation would resolve into love. It was flawless logic. It was also entirely wrong. Robert's first gift was small, a scarf, pale blue, expensive but not so expensive that it would raise questions. Eleanor accepted it with surprise and gratitude. She wore it the next performance. Robert watched her wear it and felt something that he had never felt before. He felt like he mattered, not in the abstract sense, in the concrete sense. His existence had changed something in the world. His money, which had always been just numbers and accounts, had become a physical thing that Eleanor wrapped around her shoulders. After the scarf came other small gifts, a handbag, a bottle of perfume, a pair of earrings. Each gift was calculated to be valuable enough to convey intention, but not so valuable as to obligate her or make her uncomfortable. Robert understood obligation. He worked in a casino. Everyone was calculating constantly what they owed to whom, but Eleanor's gratitude was not obligation. It was genuine. She would thank him. She would hug him. She would tell him he was kind. And each time she said he was kind, Robert heard something else entirely. He heard, "You matter. You are visible. You are not interchangeable." What Eleanor did not understand was that she was participating in an equation that Robert was solving in his head. Every gift was a variable. Every moment of her gratitude was a confirmation that his logic was sound. If he kept increasing the gifts, kept making himself more valuable to her existence, the equation would eventually solve into something he could name. By month 4, Robert had given Eleanor approximately $3,000 in gifts, money transfers, and payments for things she needed. Rent assistance, medical bills, a broken refrigerator. Eleanor accepted these as the generosity of a wealthy man who was lonely and kind. She was grateful. She was not suspicious. She was not asking questions about why a man who had never even kissed her was restructuring his finances to ensure her comfort. Robert was not being malicious. He was being mathematical. And mathematics, unlike human emotion, operates according to laws that cannot be broken, or so he believed. What Robert did not yet understand was that he was not solving an equation for love. He was creating the conditions for a different kind of tragedy, one where the victim would eventually realize she had been complicit in the destruction of someone she barely knew, and the perpetrator would realize that all his calculations had been measuring the wrong thing entirely. 6 months into knowing Eleanor, Robert made a decision that he did not recognize as a decision. It was simply the next logical step in his mathematics. He took out a second mortgage on his apartment. He liquidated his stock portfolio. He began to carefully, methodically redirect his entire financial existence toward the singular goal of Eleanor's comfort and happiness. Eleanor noticed something had shifted, but she interpreted it through the lens of her own narrative. Robert had simply decided to be generous. Some men were like that. Some men had enough and wanted to share it. She had read about men like this in magazine articles. Generous, kind, wealthy men who took pleasure in seeing women they cared about experience comfort. What Eleanor did not see was that Robert was experiencing a kind of ecstasy in his own destruction. Each dollar that left his accounts was a dollar that proved he was willing to sacrifice for her. Each new benefit he provided was proof that he was not the invisible man he had always been. He was becoming visible through his own erasure. Robert began to pay for everything. When Eleanor mentioned that her apartment was small and she hated the landlord, Robert found her a larger apartment and paid the deposit and the first 3 months' rent without her asking. When she mentioned that her car was unreliable, Robert bought her a 1959 Ford Fairlane, pale green, the kind of car that a woman like Eleanor should drive. When she mentioned a desire to travel but never had the money, Robert began planning a trip to San Francisco. He would pay for everything: hotels, food, shows. Eleanor's relationship with Robert shifted imperceptibly. What had been friendship began to resemble courtship. What had been kindness began to resemble devotion. Robert never kissed her. He never made romantic advances. He simply made himself essential to her quality of life. And Eleanor, who had spent her entire life struggling with scarcity, began to relax into abundance. She began to allow herself to need him. This is where the psychology becomes truly dangerous. Because Eleanor was not being seduced by a lie about Robert's feelings. Eleanor was being seduced by the experience of being cared for, and Robert was being seduced by the experience of mattering. Neither was lying to the other. They were both lying to themselves about what was actually happening. Robert had never been in a relationship before. He had no framework for understanding what healthy interdependence looked like. All he knew was that when Eleanor smiled at him, when she reached across a table and touched his arm, when she told him she was grateful for him, something that had been locked inside him since childhood began to unlock. He began to feel like a person instead of a system. For Eleanor, Robert represented something she had never experienced. Stability, not love, not passion, stability. The knowledge that someone would be there, that her needs would be met, that she would not have to struggle alone. She did not know that Robert was financing this stability by dismantling his own. By month 9, Robert had given Eleanor approximately $650,000. He had not told her the total amount. He had not added it up in her presence. But he knew. He counted everything. The mathematics were precise, and the mathematics told him that he was approximately halfway through his savings. Robert began to accelerate the timeline without consciously deciding to do so. He purchased a vacation home in Palm Springs, something Eleanor had mentioned wanting to visit. He bought her a diamond bracelet that had belonged to the wife of a casino executive, obtained through a contact Robert made in his work. He arranged for Eleanor to take time off from singing and accompany him on trips to Los Angeles and San Diego. Eleanor accepted these escalating gifts with growing gratitude and also, somewhere beneath her gratitude, a creeping sense of discomfort that she did not allow herself to examine too closely. Because if she examined it, she would have to ask questions, and Robert had made it very clear, through his actions, through his generosity, through his devotion, that he did not want to be questioned. He wanted to be needed. The moment Eleanor could have interrupted this cycle and chosen clarity came in month 7. She was at Robert's new apartment. He had upgraded to a luxury building, and she found bank statements on his desk. The numbers made no sense to her. She saw that he had recently liquidated significant investments. She saw that he had taken out credit against his salary. She asked him directly, "Robert, how much money do you actually have?" Robert looked at her with an expression that she could not quite read. He said, "Enough." Then he changed the subject, and Eleanor, trained by her childhood to not press men on uncomfortable topics, let it drop. She did not ask again. She did not investigate further. She accepted his answer and his implicit request that she not examine the foundation of their arrangement too closely. This moment when Eleanor could have chosen clarity and instead chose willful blindness, is the moment when she became complicit in Robert's self-destruction, not because she was malicious or calculating, but because she was comfortable, because his generosity served her needs, because asking questions might jeopardize the stability he had created, because it was easier to accept his gifts than to understand their cost. Robert, for his part, interpreted her lack of questions as acceptance, as love. He understood her silence as permission to continue, and so he continued. By the end of month 9, Robert had given Eleanor her first car, not the Ford Fairlane, but an upgrade to a newer model. He had moved her to a penthouse apartment in a new building. He had given her access to a credit card connected to his accounts. He had introduced her to casino managers as his fiancée, though he had never proposed and she had never agreed to marry him. Eleanor was living in a world that Robert had constructed entirely for her, and Robert was living in a fantasy where constructing that world was equivalent to being loved. What neither of them understood was that they had both entered a mathematics that could not be solved. Robert believed that he could purchase visibility through sacrifice. Eleanor believed that she could receive gifts without acknowledging their cost. And the casino, which Robert worked for, had no idea that one of their most trusted employees was running the most sophisticated embezzlement scheme of his career, not for himself, but for a woman who did not know she was the reason his entire life was disappearing. In month 11, Eleanor made a decision that she thought was hers, but was actually the inevitable conclusion of Robert's mathematics. She stopped singing at the Sands Casino. She quit her job. She told Robert that she wanted to focus on him, on their relationship, on the life they were building together. Robert accepted this without celebration. For him, this was simply confirmation that his equation was resolving correctly. Eleanor had chosen him. She had chosen dependence on him. She had allowed him to become the central organizing principle of her existence. This was what he had been calculating toward all along. What neither of them articulated was the catastrophic loss embedded in this decision. Eleanor had given up the one thing that made her visible to the world: her voice, her performances, her independent identity. She had traded identity for security, and Robert had made the trade possible by making security the only thing he offered. Eleanor moved into Robert's apartment full-time. She spent her days arranging his life, deciding what he would eat, planning his weekends, organizing his space. She had been transformed from a woman with her own career into a woman who existed primarily in relation to him. And Robert, who had spent his entire life being invisible, finally had someone whose entire world revolved around his existence. But invisibility, once it becomes your fundamental mode of being, doesn't disappear just because someone is finally paying attention. It simply changes shape. Robert became obsessed with control, not in a violent or obviously malicious way. In the way that a man who has been powerless for 50 years exercises power through the only mechanism he understands: money. He began to monitor Eleanor's spending. He questioned her about where she went, whom she saw. He created rules about her social interactions. He told her that women in her position, maintained women as he thought of her, should not be visible in public in ways that might invite questions. Eleanor accepted this because it aligned with a narrative she had been raised with. Men protected women. Men controlled what women did because they were taking care of them. Her father had done the same thing, and her father's control, while it had crushed her, had also provided a kind of security. The security of knowing exactly what was expected. The security of not having to make decisions. But underneath this acceptance, Eleanor began to experience something she did not name, a growing sense that she had made a mistake, that in accepting Robert's generosity, she had traded one kind of invisibility for another. She had gone from being a woman with a voice to being a woman who existed only in relation to a man's need for her to exist. Robert, meanwhile, was accelerating toward something he could not understand. He had given Eleanor approximately $2 million by month 11. He had calculated that he could sustain this rate of giving for another year, perhaps 14 months before his accounts were depleted beyond the point of recovery, and he was approaching that deadline with a kind of mathematical precision that felt like inevitability. He began to make plans. He would propose to Eleanor, not because he wanted to marry her, but because marriage would make his financial support of her legal and legitimate. Husbands give money to wives. That was how the world worked. Marriage would transform his embezzlement into a normal family structure. He also began to make contingency plans, though he did not acknowledge them as such. He began to research other cities. He began to consider the possibility that he might have to leave Las Vegas eventually. He made sure his personal documents were in order. He was, in essence, preparing for the moment when the mathematics would no longer work. But what Robert did not anticipate, could not anticipate because it existed outside the framework of his understanding, was that his invisibility would eventually catch up with him, that the very systems he had spent his life maintaining would eventually notice that the numbers did not match, that the world he had escaped into through Eleanor would be interrupted by the world that had formed around him in his years of invisibility. Eleanor, in month 12, told Robert that she was unhappy. She used careful language. She said she missed singing. She said she felt isolated. She said she wanted more independence. She asked him tentatively if she could return to her job at the Sands. Robert's response was immediate and absolute. No, she did not need to work. She had everything she needed. What more could she possibly want? He was providing for her. He was taking care of her. What was the purpose of independence when she had security? Eleanor heard in his voice something she recognized from her childhood. She heard a man who believed that financial dependence was equivalent to love, that control was equivalent to care. She heard the closing of a door that could not be reopened, and for the first time she began to wonder what Robert was actually paying for when he gave her all this money. She began to understand that his generosity was not simple, that it came with prices that were not financial, that she had not been rescued, she had been purchased. But Eleanor was now dependent on Robert's income. She had no job. She had no savings of her own. She had allowed him to restructure her entire existence around his. And so she did what people do when they realize they have made a terrible mistake but cannot afford to leave. She began to become invisible herself. She stopped asking questions. She stopped wanting things. She reduced her needs to the bare minimum of existing. Robert interpreted this withdrawal as love, as understanding, as the inevitable settling into a permanent arrangement. He did not see it as the slow disappearance of Eleanor into a woman who was being erased. By month 13, Eleanor had calculated something that Robert had not. She was adding up the cost of her comfort. She was noticing things that suggested Robert's finances were not what he had told her. His anxiety was increasing. His control was tightening. His universe was contracting. And she began to understand that his generosity might not be infinite, that it might, in fact, be reaching its limit. She also began to understand something about love that Robert had never learned, that love is not expressed through erasure. Love is expressed through presence. And a man who gives you everything while demanding that you become invisible is not loving you. He is consuming you. Eleanor began to have moments, small, private moments, where she imagined leaving, imagined returning to work, imagined a life that was hers instead of his. But each time she imagined it, she felt the weight of her dependence. She had no money. She had no job prospects. How could she explain the gap in her employment? She had no friends left. Robert had systematically created a situation where he was her only connection to the world. She was trapped, not by chains, by mathematics, by the simple arithmetic of a woman who had been made dependent by a man who had been made invisible, and who was trying to purchase visibility through her. The seduction of mattering, it turned out, was a trap that caught both the seducer and the seduced, and neither of them could escape without destroying the other first. In month 15, Robert had given Eleanor approximately $3,200,000. The mathematics were becoming more visible to him. He could see the trajectory. At the current rate, he would be completely depleted in 6 months. His apartment would be paid off. He had been making large lump sum payments toward the mortgage. His car would be paid off. His living expenses would be covered by his salary from the casino. But any emergency, any crisis, any unexpected necessity would force him to liquidate what little he had left. Robert began to experience something that approximated panic, though he would never have used that word. He began to feel, for the first time in his adult life, that he was reaching the end of something, that the mathematics that had governed his existence since childhood were failing him. He began to work longer hours at the casino. He volunteered for extra shifts. He began to examine the accounts more carefully, looking for anomalies that he could theoretically exploit, not for himself but as a contingency plan. If his own money ran out, there were other ways to provide for Eleanor. There were always other ways. One simply had to understand the systems thoroughly enough. Eleanor, watching this transformation, understood that something had shifted. Robert's anxiety was now visible even to her. He would lie awake at night. He would check his accounts obsessively. He would sit at his desk for hours reading and rereading numbers that never changed. Eleanor finally, in month 16, asked him directly, "Are you in financial trouble?" Robert answered with honesty. "Yes," he said, "but not in the way you think. I am fine. I will always be fine. I will always take care of you." But Eleanor understood now that this was not true. She understood that his fineness and his ability to take care of her were two different things. And she began to understand something else, that she had been accepting money from a man who was destroying himself to give it to her. And she had known this, at least partially, and had accepted it anyway because his destruction was easier to ignore than her own dependence. In month 17, Eleanor did something that Robert had been afraid of since the beginning. She went back to the Sands Casino. She did not tell Robert. She simply showed up on a Tuesday night to apply for her old job. The managers were surprised but delighted. They remembered her. She had a voice. She had presence. She could start the following week. Eleanor returned to singing, but now she was no longer the woman Robert had been financing. She was a woman who was reconstructing her own identity, who was earning her own money, who was, slowly and deliberately, extracting herself from the mathematics that Robert had created. Robert discovered this when Eleanor came home after her first night performing. He could see it immediately, not just in her words, but in her physical presence. She was different. She was becoming visible again. She was becoming a person instead of a function. Robert's response was to accelerate the timeline further. If Eleanor was reestablishing her independence, then the entire equation was collapsing. He needed to make her more dependent, not less. He needed to restructure the mathematics before they could be restructured by her. He began to make final gifts, the most significant financial transfers. He took out additional loans against his apartment. He liquidated the last of his retirement accounts. He made wire transfers to Eleanor's personal accounts, amounts that were large enough that they could not be ignored, could not be accepted without acknowledgement. Eleanor saw these transfers and understood that something was very wrong. She did not understand the full scope of what was happening, but she understood that Robert was in crisis, that his financial structure was collapsing, and she understood finally that she needed to know the truth. She asked him directly and with no room for evasion, "How much money have you given me? How much of your money is actually mine?" Robert, for the first time since he had begun this arithmetic, did something other than calculate. He told her the truth. $4,700,000. Over 15 months. Everything he had worked for over 23 years. All of it, flowing to her, because he believed that in doing so, he was purchasing the right to exist in her life. Eleanor's response was silence. And then she did something that Robert had not anticipated and could not understand. She cried, not because she was grateful, not because she was moved, but because she understood finally the true cost of what had happened. She understood that she had been complicit in the destruction of another human being, that she had accepted gifts knowing, somewhere deep in her consciousness, that their cost was unsustainable, that she had allowed a man to erase himself for her, and more than that, she understood that this was not love. This was pathology. This was a man expressing every dysfunction of his invisible life through the only mechanism he understood, money, and she had enabled it. She had accepted it. She had allowed herself to become the instrument of his self-destruction. Eleanor left Robert's apartment that night. She took almost nothing. She returned to her own apartment, the one Robert had not paid for, the one she had rented with money she had earned herself, and she understood that she was leaving a man who had loved her with a kind of desperate, absolute devotion that was impossible to reciprocate because it was not based on who she actually was. It was based on who she represented to him, the possibility of visibility. Robert, left alone in the apartment he had mortgaged beyond his ability to recover, understood something that he had never consciously considered before. He understood that in his attempt to make himself visible to Eleanor, he had made himself invisible to everyone else. That his embezzlement, because that is what it was, regardless of his motivations, was about to be discovered. That the systems he had maintained so carefully for so long were about to collapse. And he understood that he had done all of this for a woman who did not love him, had never loved him, had been grateful to him, yes, had accepted his generosity, yes, but had never loved him, and that the mathematics he had been running were always going to fail because they were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what love actually requires. It requires, at minimum, the presence of two people, and Robert had spent so long being invisible that he had become incapable of being present, and Eleanor, accepting his gifts, had been present only to the convenience he offered, not to him as a person. The tragedy was not that Eleanor had deceived Robert. The tragedy was that they had both deceived themselves about what they were participating in, and in that mutual self-deception, they had created something that neither of them could survive intact. The casino discovered the embezzlement on a Thursday in July, 3 weeks after Eleanor left. It was discovered not through Robert's carelessness, but through a routine audit that one of his colleagues, a man named Marcus, had decided to conduct more thoroughly than usual. Marcus had worked beside Robert for 7 years, and had always found something unsettling about Robert's precision, his absolute dedication to accuracy, his refusal to take vacations or time off. Invisible men did not usually maintain that level of attention to their work. Invisible men usually began to slip. And Marcus, who was not particularly perceptive, had developed an instinct that something was fundamentally wrong with Robert's accounts. What Marcus found was not embezzlement in the traditional sense. Robert had not stolen money and hidden it in accounts under false names. Robert had not created phantom transactions or laundered casino money through external schemes. Robert had done something far more transparent and, in its own way, far more damning. He had simply transferred money from the accounts he was responsible for auditing to personal accounts, and then transferred it from his personal accounts to Eleanor. The trail was visible to anyone who looked carefully enough, and Marcus, once he began to look, could not stop looking. The amounts were too regular, too large, too consistent to be anything other than an intentional pattern. Robert was called into the office of Mr. Gerald Hammond, the casino manager, on a Friday afternoon. Hammond had worked in Las Vegas long enough to understand that money disappeared from casinos in many ways, but in his 30 years of experience, he had never encountered an embezzler as meticulous as Robert, as organized, as committed to detailed documentation of every transaction. "Can you explain these transfers?" Hammond asked, placing a spreadsheet on the desk between them. Robert looked at the spreadsheet. It was a list of every transfer he had made over the past 15 months. It was organized chronologically. It was accurate. It was complete. And looking at it, Robert felt something that was almost like relief. The mathematics were finally being exposed. The invisible man was finally being seen. "I gave the money to Eleanor Voss," Robert said. There was no point in lying. The documentation was complete. Any attempt at deception would only make his situation worse. "How much?" Hammond asked. $4,700,000, Robert said. He did not say, approximately. He had counted. He always counted. Hammond sat back in his chair. He was a man who had encountered many varieties of human dysfunction, but this level of dedication to financial self-destruction was remarkable. "Why?" he asked. Robert considered the question carefully. It seemed simple, but the answer was not simple. The answer involved decades of invisibility. It involved the understanding that he had no value except in his utility to others. It involved the belief that if he could make himself useful enough, if he could provide enough, someone would finally see him. "I was in love with her," Robert said. It was the most honest answer he could give, though it was also the least accurate. He was not in love with Eleanor. He was in love with the idea of being loved. He was in love with the possibility that his existence mattered. He was in love with the person he had imagined Eleanor to be, rather than with Eleanor herself. But Robert did not explain this. He simply sat in the chair and waited. Hammond called in the Las Vegas Police Department. Robert was arrested for embezzlement. He was taken from the casino in handcuffs. His 23 years of employment at the Sands were over. His career in accounting was finished. His freedom was over. But the most significant loss had already occurred. That loss had occurred when Eleanor left him. That loss had been the loss of the fantasy that had sustained him through 50 years of invisibility. The case was prosecuted quickly. Robert's documentation was so complete that there was no defense. He had embezzled money. He had admitted it. He would go to prison. The judge, sensing the particular pathology involved in the case, sentenced him to 8 years in the Nevada State Prison at Carson City. During the trial, Eleanor was called to testify. She had to explain her relationship with Robert, her understanding of his financial situation, her knowledge of where the money he gave her came from. It was humiliating for her. It was also a kind of clarity. Sitting in the witness stand, she finally understood the full scope of what had happened. She finally understood that she had been the instrument of Robert's self-destruction, whether she had intended to be or not. The prosecutor asked her, "Did you know that the money was being embezzled from the casino?" Eleanor considered lying. She considered saying she had had no knowledge, no understanding, no way of knowing. It would have been the easier answer. It would have been the answer that absolved her of complicity. But Eleanor, who had been reduced to invisibility in Robert's apartment, and who had reconstructed her visibility through her own work, chose a different answer. "I knew," she said. "Not the specifics, but I knew something was wrong, and I chose not to investigate it too closely because as long as I didn't know, I could accept the gifts without acknowledging what they cost him." It was a statement that the prosecutor had not expected. It was also a statement that would haunt Eleanor for the rest of her life, because in acknowledging her complicity, she was also acknowledging that she had allowed someone to destroy themselves for her, and she had rationalized that destruction by choosing not to look too closely at it. Robert, sitting in the courtroom, heard Eleanor's testimony, and for the first time he saw her clearly, not as the possibility of being loved, not as the instrument of his invisibility becoming visible, but as a person, as a woman who had been forced to make impossible choices because he had restructured her life around his needs. He understood, finally, that the deception had not been Eleanor deceiving him. The deception had been him deceiving himself. He had deceived himself about what love requires. He had deceived himself about whether love can be purchased. He had deceived himself about whether becoming invisible for someone else is the same as being loved by them. And Eleanor, in her testimony, had named the second layer of deception. She had deceived herself as well. She had chosen not to know the full truth because knowing it would have required her to give up the security he offered. She had been complicit in his destruction through her own willful blindness. After the trial, Eleanor walked out of the courthouse and did not see Robert again. He was taken to prison. She was released back into the world. And both of them would spend the rest of their lives understanding that they had been destroyed not by each other, but by their own inability to see each other clearly. Robert Chen spent the first month of his incarceration in the Carson City prison in a state of almost profound calm. He had spent his entire life living in a state of crisis, the crisis of invisibility, the crisis of not mattering, the crisis of trying to purchase visibility through the manipulation of numbers. Prison, paradoxically, was a kind of relief. His decisions had been removed from him. His agency had been revoked. He was now invisible again, but in a way that felt more honest than it had before. He was finally what he had always been, a man who did not matter to the world. And there was something almost peaceful in the acceptance of this fact. But peace, he discovered, was not the same as understanding. And understanding, he discovered, required a kind of pain that he had not anticipated. Slowly, over weeks and months, the implications of what he had done began to settle into his consciousness. He had not just committed a crime. He had not just embezzled money. He had systematically dismantled his own life in service to a fantasy. And in doing so, he had destroyed Eleanor's ability to live freely. He had made her complicit in his crime. He had forced her to testify against him in court. He had turned her into an instrument of his own legal destruction. Robert began to correspond with Eleanor through letters. Not love letters, something else entirely. Letters in which he tried to explain what he had done and why. Letters in which he tried to articulate the decades of invisibility that had led him to believe that financial sacrifice was equivalent to love. Eleanor did not respond to the first letters, but eventually she wrote back, not with forgiveness, but with honesty. She told him that she had tried to return to singing, but she could not. Every time she got on stage, she saw him sitting at his table alone, and she could not separate the memory of his attention from the knowledge of his crime. She told him that she had moved to San Francisco, trying to escape the weight of what had happened. She told him that she was seeing a therapist trying to understand why she had accepted his gifts knowing, at least partially, what they were costing him. And she told him something that Robert needed to hear. You were never invisible. You were just choosing not to be seen. This statement, simple, accurate, devastating, became the foundation for Robert's years in prison. He began to understand that invisibility was not something that had been done to him. It was something he had done to himself. That throughout his life he had made choices to remain silent, to remain separate, to remain unconnected. And the reason Eleanor had not loved him was not because there was something wrong with Eleanor. It was because he had not presented her with anything real to love. He had presented her with a function, a resource, an extension of his own fantasies about what love should look like. Eleanor, in her letters, was processing a different but complementary realization. She was understanding that in accepting Robert's gifts, she had allowed herself to be shaped by his fantasies as well, that she had traded her independence for security, that she had been so grateful for his attention, that she had failed to ask whether his attention was based on who she actually was or on who she represented to him. Their correspondence continued for 3 years. It was not a romance. It was a slow, painful process of two people trying to understand the ways in which they had destroyed each other, not through malice, but through their mutual inability to see clearly. In year 4 of Robert's incarceration, Eleanor stopped writing. In her final letter, she explained that she was getting married to another man, someone she had met through a mutual friend, someone who did not know her history, someone who wanted to know her as she was in the present, not as she had been in the past. Robert, reading this letter, felt something unexpected. He felt relief and grief and a kind of understanding that he had not previously possessed. Eleanor's marriage lasted 7 years. It ended not because her husband was cruel or because she was unfaithful, but because Eleanor could never fully trust the margins of a relationship. She was always calculating the cost of being cared for. She was always measuring what her husband was giving up. She was always waiting for the moment when his attention would transform into control, when his generosity would become the basis for domination. She eventually moved to Los Angeles and rebuilt a career as a voice coach. She never performed publicly again. The part of her that had sung seemed to have been permanently silenced, but she found meaning in teaching others to use their voices, and she found a kind of peace in understanding that her silence was not Robert's doing. It was her own choice. She had chosen to stop singing because singing reminded her of him, and continuing to sing would have required her to reclaim a part of herself that felt permanently connected to her time with Robert. Robert was released from prison after serving 6 years with time off for good behavior. He was 56 years old. He had no job prospects. He had no family contacts. His siblings had severed all connection to him during the trial. He had no friends. He had no money. He had essentially been returned to the world as completely invisible as he had entered prison, except now he was also a convicted felon. He lived in a transitional housing program for formerly incarcerated individuals. He worked as a dishwasher in a restaurant, a job that suited him because it required no identity, no interaction, no need to be visible. He lived quietly. He did not attempt to contact Eleanor. He did not attempt to reconstruct any version of his previous life. But in the evenings he did something that he had not done before. He began to write. Not letters, not explanations. He began to write about his understanding of what had happened. He began to articulate the psychology of invisibility. He began to chronicle the ways in which a person could live an entire life believing that they did not matter, and how that belief could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. His writing was not published. It was not meant to be published. It was a kind of penance, a way of processing the destruction he had caused, a way of understanding that love, real love, required presence, required seeing and being seen, required the vulnerability of being a full, flawed, visible human being to someone else. The most significant loss, Robert came to understand, was not the money. The money was abstract, it was numerical. It meant nothing except what people decided it meant. The most significant loss was the years of Eleanor's life that had been shaped by his inability to love her in any way other than through the erasure of himself. The most significant loss was the years of his own life that had been spent pursuing visibility through the only mechanism he understood, the elimination of his own needs, his own desires, his own self. And Eleanor's loss was different, but equally profound. She had lost the years during which she might have developed a stable mutual relationship. She had lost her voice, not literally, but the ability to use it in the way that had brought her the most joy. She had lost her trust in the benevolence of other people's attention. She had lost the capacity to receive care without calculating its cost. The ledger of what they had lost could never be balanced. The mathematics that had governed their relationship could never be resolved. The only thing that remained was the understanding that they had destroyed each other, not through cruelty, but through their own fundamental inability to see each other clearly. They had been victims not of each other, but of their own disconnection from reality. And that understanding, while it provided no consolation, at least offered clarity. 20 years later, in 1981, Robert Chen was working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in downtown Las Vegas. He was 68 years old. He lived alone in a small apartment, not unlike the one he had inhabited before Eleanor. He had no family, no close friends, no romantic relationships. He attended work, completed his tasks, and returned home. He had become once again invisible. But there was a critical difference between the invisibility of his youth and the invisibility of his later years. The invisibility of his youth had been a kind of armor, a protection against the risk of being seen and rejected. The invisibility of his later years was a kind of clarity. He understood now that he had chosen invisibility, that it had been a choice, made over and over again, to not present himself to the world, to not risk rejection, to not insist on mattering. Eleanor was 50 years old. She was living in Pasadena, California, teaching voice to young musicians. She had never married again after her 7-year marriage ended. She lived alone but not lonely. She had developed friendships with her students' families. She had created a life for herself that was built on her own terms, not on the terms of someone else's fantasy about who she was. She never went back to the Sands Casino. She never returned to Las Vegas. But she did allow herself occasionally to sing when she was alone. She would sing in her car. She would sing in her shower. She would sing softly to herself while preparing meals. Her voice had not left her. It had only been silenced. And in her later years she reclaimed it, not for an audience but for herself. Not as a performance, but as a form of presence. If Eleanor and Robert could have been in the same room 20 years later, what would they have understood? What would they have learned? Robert would have understood that the money he gave her was never the point, that love expressed through financial sacrifice is not love. It is a form of control, a way of making someone indebted to you. a way of purchasing the right to shape their life, and that Eleanor, in accepting his gifts, had been complicit in her own diminishment, not because she was cruel or calculating, but because she was desperate for stability, because she was willing to trade freedom for security, because she had not yet learned that security purchased at the cost of autonomy is not security, it is a prison. Eleanor would have understood that Robert's attention, while it had felt like love, had actually been a kind of consuming need, that she had been not a person to him, but a function, a repository for all the love and attention he had been denied his entire life, and that attempting to fill that void with her own presence would have been impossible, that no amount of being there for him could have made him visible to himself. But more importantly, both of them would have understood something crucial about the nature of deception. The story between them was not a story of one person deceiving another. It was a story of two people deceiving themselves. Eleanor deceiving herself that she could accept financial gifts without examining their cost. Robert deceiving himself that he could purchase visibility through the elimination of his own needs. And both of them deceiving themselves that this arrangement was sustainable, ethical, or based on genuine connection. The tragedy of their story is that it could have been different. There were moments when either of them could have interrupted the cycle. Robert could have been honest about his financial limitations. Eleanor could have asked directly how much money he was giving her. Robert could have risked presenting his real, flawed, vulnerable self instead of attempting to construct a version of himself that Eleanor might love. Eleanor could have recognized that his attention was not based on seeing her, but on using her as an instrument of his own salvation. But they did not do these things. And the reason they did not is the most important part of the story. They did not do these things because doing so would have required them to tolerate discomfort, to tolerate the uncertainty of honest communication, to risk rejection, to risk revealing themselves as imperfect, needy, human, and in avoiding that discomfort, they created something far more painful. They created a structure in which both of them were systematically erased, in which love became indistinguishable from control, in which giving became a way of taking, in which receiving became a way of losing autonomy. What does this story reveal about us? What does this story reveal about how we love, how we deceive ourselves, how we mistake financial security for emotional connection? The answer is difficult, because the answer is that Robert could be any of us. The person who has learned that invisibility is safety, who has learned that the only way to matter is to provide, who has learned that love is not something you receive, but something you buy, who has learned that the safest way to love is to love someone who needs you, because need is the only guarantee of presence. And Eleanor could be any of us, the person who has learned that accepting help is the same as being loved, who has learned that security is worth more than autonomy, who has learned that asking questions about the cost of generosity might jeopardize the generosity itself, who has learned that it is safer to be grateful than to be honest. Could this happen to you? Could you find yourself in Robert's position, believing that you can purchase love through the elimination of yourself? Could you find yourself in Eleanor's position, accepting gifts without examining their cost because examining them would require you to relinquish security? The answer is yes, because the psychology that connected Robert and Eleanor is not unique to them. It is a psychology that exists in every relationship where there is a power imbalance. It exists in every arrangement where one person's need is greater than their capacity to articulate it. It exists in every transaction where money becomes a substitute for honesty. The final insight, the one that neither Robert nor Eleanor could fully articulate, is this: visibility cannot be purchased. It can only be offered, and it must be offered freely by a person who is willing to be seen exactly as they are, not perfect, not wealthy, not capable of solving someone else's loneliness, but present, real, visible in their full humanity. Robert spent his final years coming to understand this. He did not become happy. He did not become fulfilled. But he did become for the first time genuinely invisible in a way that was not armor. He accepted that his life would be quiet, that he would not be remembered, that his existence would not have left a significant mark on the world. And in accepting this, he found a kind of peace that had eluded him when he was fighting so desperately to matter. Eleanor also found a kind of peace, though of a different sort. She found peace in the understanding that she had survived her own complicity, that she had reconstructed a life that was hers, that she had chosen her own visibility, even when that visibility came without the promise of love. She had chosen presence over security, and that choice, while it had come at great cost, had ultimately saved her. The story of Robert and Eleanor is a story about deception, but it is not a story about one person deceiving another. It is a story about how we all deceive ourselves, how we construct narratives about love and security and visibility that allow us to avoid the terrifying truth that love requires vulnerability, that presence requires the risk of rejection, that visibility cannot be purchased. It can only be offered freely by two people who are willing to see each other exactly as they are. And that is the most difficult kind of honesty. That is the kind of honesty that most of us spend our lives avoiding. That is the kind of honesty that Robert and Eleanor never quite managed to offer each other. They were not villains. They were not exceptionally cruel or calculating. They were simply human. And like most humans, they were capable of extraordinary self-deception when facing the alternative, genuine connection. The question that closes this story is not, could this happen to you? The question is, how many of us are, right now, in some version of Robert's position or Eleanor's? How many of us are creating structures in which we are systematically becoming invisible, or allowing ourselves to be made invisible, because the alternative is too frightening to contemplate? The answer to that question might reveal more about ourselves than we are willing to see.